Hear ye, hear ye. Everybody please come to order. Well, good evening. Welcome. Thanks for coming, especially to you first-timers. I'm seeing some new faces here tonight. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Golden Valley Historical Society. My name is Kenneth Huber. I am the president of the society this year, and as is customary, I'll get started with a few brief opening remarks, and we'll get to our featured speaker quickly without too much further ado. A couple of general announcements. Our next general membership meeting is going to be right here on Thursday, March 8th, and the program will feature our own David Kubel on the history of Highway 100, I think. I'm told it's still a work in progress, but it should be ready by the 8th. I'm sure it'll be fascinating. David did a wonderful one on family history for this past season, and he does a terrific job, so I'm really looking forward to it. The development of the Golden Valley Historical Society Museum is on schedule. We had a special meeting last night to talk about it some more, and we're looking forward to a grand opening in mid-May. Mid-May. We don't have a specific date yet, but watch for further details in our newsletter or in some of the local newspapers, including the Star Tribune. One of our fundraising projects is to sell these wonderful vintage Golden Valley street signs. How many of these do you think we've sold so far? We've sold almost 500. Almost 500 to current and former Golden Valley residents. And because alumni of the Golden Valley High School are on websites and so forth, they spot them and they'd like to have one for their den or rec room or rumpus room or what have you, so we wind up shipping them all over the country. But it is first come, first served, and we have limited quantities of certain signs. They're 25 bucks a piece, and we have order forms here in the back. We also have a list of the streets that are available right now, and gradually some more streets will become available as the city crews take down the old signs and put up the new ones. So even if you don't see yours here tonight, check back later, because we might have it. Also, if you or someone you know is interested in getting married, they can have their wedding right here at the Golden Valley Historical Society. We will rent the facility for a day, 2 days, for small weddings, up to about 50, 60, I think 70 people or so, it might be our max. So keep that in mind and refer your wedding candidates to us. Refreshments will be served as usual after the program this evening. The cookie volunteer this month is Steve Schmidgall. Thank you, Steve. Okay, I am now to present the presenter of our featured speaker here tonight, and that is Peggy Lepick. Peggy's a member here of the Golden Valley Historical Society, and of course of the League of Women Voters. She served our community as a member of the Golden Valley Planning Commission, a member of the Minnesota State Legislature, and she served as a member of the Metropolitan Council under Governor Polenti. She currently serves on the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board, and I understand Peggy will talk a little about the League of Women Voters and in turn introduce Ms. Van Hoffman. So, ladies and gentlemen, Peggy Lepick.
Thank you, Ken. And if I can find a way of attaching this thing, well, I don't know. Maybe that's a lost cause. I'll just hang on to it. That may be the problem. Okay, I'll hold it like this. Well, good evening, everybody. The League of Women Voters is very pleased to co-sponsor this evening's meeting about the Metropolitan Council. The council has been an important factor in developing the metro region and keeping it viable and competitive. This meeting will be followed on Saturday, February 24th, with a second program on the Met Council focusing on governance. It will be at Brookview Golden Valley. That's the new Golden Valley Community Center. They don't call it a community center, but that's where it is. From 10 to 11:30, and is free and open to the public. The speakers are Steve Dornfeld, former Public Affairs Director for the Met Council, and Chris Gerlach, Dakota County Commissioner and also a former state senator. And we do have a few flyers on that meeting in the back there. If you're interested in coming, help yourself. If we run out of them, just let me know and I can email you one. Our local league has had 4 members serve on the Met Council. The first was Betty Kane, who served from 1976 to 1979. She was appointed by Governor Wendell Anderson. She was followed by Pat Hasselwell, who was appointed by Governor Al Klee and served from 1979 to 1984. Our own Mary Anderson, sitting back there, served as chair of the council in 1991 to 1992, appointed by Governor Arnie Carlson. And then, as Ken Huber mentioned, I represented our district, appointed by Governor Tim Pawlenty from 2003 to 2011. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have with us the current executive director of the Citizens League to share the history and current issues of the Met Council. The Citizens League is an organization that is similar to the League of Women Voters in that it involves citizens about learning about issues and making recommendations to various levels of government. It was formed as a metropolitan group and now it operates statewide. Pahui Yang Hoffman joined the Citizens League in May of 2014 as a staff member to lead the development of policy recommendations with its members and partners. And then this last December, she became the executive director. Prior to her joining the Citizens League, she served as manager of government affairs and content administration with Twin Cities Public Television. For 7 years, she led the station's government relations, educating elected officials on TPT programs, as well as monitoring policy changes affecting public broadcasting. Pahua holds a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Minnesota and an MBA from the University of St. Thomas. Pahua, we thank you very much for being here and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Peggy. Excuse me a moment while I get this.
Yeah.
I want you all to hear me.
Good.
Does this work?
That's better.
I'm going to put this in my pocket.
Yeah.
So I've done this before on Almanac. It's what they told me to do. Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome, Steve and Peggy. I'm really excited to be here with you tonight. I'm really excited to be the executive director of the Citizens League. I have some magazines. It's a new Citizens League magazine that was launched last October. And in this new issue, I got to write my first column. And one of the things I thought I would do in my introduction quickly is, in it I mentioned how I immigrated here to the United States with my parents. I'm the oldest of 4 and the only one born overseas. And one of the things that I look back on now that I'm the executive director is that having been the first in my family to truly learn English, I became quickly the interpreter and the translator in my family. Look over documents, from mortgage documents to health records, so that my parents can make informed decisions for our family. And looking back now at my career, I've sort of always done that. Relay complicated information in plain language so that people can understand and make well-informed decisions. And so what I may have felt as a 13-year-old as a burden, I now see as a 4-year-old as almost a calling. I really enjoy what I do, and I'm so lucky to get to do what I am charged to do with the Citizens League. So with that, I thought where I would take us is a journey, the beginnings of the region, just before Met Council, and take us through to some of the milestone changes of the Met Council. And then the arc where I'd like to leave us here tonight is, what are the current challenges? What are people debating now up at the legislature? What is being printed in our newspaper about the Met Council? How does that sound? So I'm going to try to do this in the time that I'm allotted, and I certainly want to leave some time for questions. And so someone's going to have to watch the time, because I could go on. Because this is actually been an interesting topic for me, because I didn't know anything about the Met Council prior to taking this role. And so the way that I've structured my talk, I'm going to reference many of the documents that I printed out for you. As you heard from Peggy's introduction, I was a history major, and so when you've all asked me to come talk about the history of the Met Council, I thought, well, if I were a college professor, this is how I would structure it. So let me take you back. So the problem the legislature began to address, first of all, who knows Mr. Ted Coldery? I expect a few hands up. So Mr. Ted Coldery, I probably have logged, 20 hours or so talking to Mr. Ted Coldery. So much of my talk is informed by him and the history he has with the Met Council. I also have spent quite a bit of time with Ms. Deborah Dyson, nonpartisan research staff in the Minnesota House, and she still works there. So if you hear things that sound a lot like Ted, it's because it's probably Ted's voice telling me what to say. So the problem the legislature began to address was the rapidly growing disparity, what Ted would call the legal city and the real city. There were exceptions, but after World War II, the population in Minneapolis and St. Paul spread into new housing outside of the city limits and major new cities, creating suburbs. This phenomenon, as we all know, happened all across the country. This growth soon became out of scale with the smaller governmental units in the region, with the legal city becoming a neighborhood of the real city. And the question the legislature was trying to grapple with was how to respond to this new situation, this new growth. In late 1950s, Governor Freeman called a Metropolitan Conference. In 1957, State Senator Elmer Anderson authored a bill creating the Metropolitan Planning Commission. In 1959, 2 years later, the legislature created the Minnesota Municipal Commission. There was a report, $4 million by 2000, a preliminary proposal for guiding change. Does anybody remember that report? Oh, Patty does. So this was in 1964, and it got a lot of people's attention. As football and baseball expanded nationally, Major League Sports played a role in the conversation, since each entity wanted to put a team in Minnesota. So St. Paul wanted one, Minneapolis wanted one. But if Minneapolis and St. Paul were to go their separate ways, they would be minor leagues, the 27th and the 43rd largest city in America. If they wanted to think of the region as a whole, the cities needed to be united to create the 15th largest city in America. These conversations led to the recognition that having a first-class metropolitan area made Minnesota count nationally, that the social, economic, and political health of the Twin Cities areas was essential to the prosperity of the state. As such, Minnesota became to concentrate things within the Twin Cities region. So think about the prison, the state capitol, the University of Minnesota, even the state fair, all centered here in the region. By 1958, a big decision had to be made about the layout of the freeways and the groundwater contamination crisis, which revealed that hundreds of thousands of people were burying their sewage and drawing their water from their backyards. The drinking water problem was quickly resolved, but the sewage problem proved tougher to fix. The Minneapolis-St. Paul Sanitary District, also known as MSSD, created in the 1930s, had interceptors running from the Pig's Eye plant downstream, but most suburbs didn't think first to contact the MSSD. Groups of suburbs proposed different solutions. The legislature tried many times to come up with a solution in 1959, in 61, in 63, and again in 65. In 1963, a frustrated Senator Rosenmeyer put through legislation giving the State Commissioner of Administration full authority to design and build a system and levy the cost onto the region. Unfortunately, it was too sweeping, an assertion of authority, and that law was never implemented. But the succession of these failures taught two important lessons. The first was about the limited capacity and capability of intergovernmental cooperation. The other was the need for a regional mechanism able to develop a representative and politically responsible proposal on the basis which the legislature could act. So after 1965, officials and organizations, public and private, got down to discuss the design of a metropolitan body that could tackle these regional issues and create good policy. So what was the purpose? What were they trying to do, this group of private and public groups? What they're trying to, the idea was not to abolish local units of government and create a consolidated regional, the idea was not to abolish local units of government, but it was to create a consolidated regional government. The idea was also to provide a kind of architecture and general contractor function to guide those developing regions. There was a lot of disagreement as to whether this should involve consolidating the regional entities, sewer, airport, and by that time transit into an operating council. Or should the agencies be left intact, removing only their independence? In the end, the Citizens League Study Committee at that time proposed the operating council, and the legislators accepted this for their bill. The consensus was that this council would represent the people, the public, with a system of equal population districts. The 1960s witnessed a change in representation, old arrangements representing geographic areas giving way to equal population districts. The consensus came together at the St. Thomas Conference in November 1966. Let's see here. Rather than create a new equal population district, Senator Ogdahl at that time and Representative Frenzel used the state Senate districts as the council's districts. And an election process was implied in the original plan for the Met Council. Keep that in mind because that's going to come up later. In 1967, however, the legislature departed significantly from the regional consensus. Midway through the session, outstate conservatives and a minority of Twin Cities area legislators introduced a bill. At the end of that session, Frenzel compromised and accepted a gubernatorial appointment for Met Council members, amending it to add district representation. And the final bill included these elements. It would created the council charging it to return to the following session with the final bill included 7 county areas representing the area metropolitan jurisdiction. It adopted the concept of representing people, so equal population districts, combining the Senate districts by 2s to create a council with initially 14 districts. And it provided for members to be appointed by the governor within those districts. In 1969, so the Citizens League report was in 1967. In 1969, the legislature essentially adopted that model of a coordinating council, which had been endorsed prior to the session by the Citizens League. What the legislature then created was essentially a state agency to oversee metropolitan affairs. And just by way of background, in 1966, the congressional legislation aiming to create and implement a coherent national urban policy had required that each region in the country create a regional council charged to develop a regional plan in order to review all local applications for federal aid. So at that time, there were some council of government concept was introduced. But thanks to Minnesota Congressman Frazier, he had added to that act in 1981, who was on the House floor, added language, except otherwise provided by state legislation. And this allowed the Met Council to really happen here. The shift to thinking of the Twin Cities area as one region has been positive. Minnesota still remains the 16th largest region in the nation. The challenges today are different, but no less important and no less difficult. Local interests may not be regional interests and sometimes not in the public interest. And this is one of the reasons why it was created. If you have this document here, that the 1994 Reorganization Act, I'm going to mention that in a little bit, so you might want to just get that out. So that was sort of the backdrop of how the Met Council was created. Just the burgeoning growth and the wastewater, it needed a regional attention. And so the Citizens League members at that time, private and public entities got together to create the 67 report that led to the creation of the Met Council. Any questions about that early history? I'm now going to talk about sort of the major changes in the Met Council around the mid-90s. In 1992, there were many proposals being created to restructure the Met Council. Many were driven by issues related to transportation, but also the comprehensive planning by local governments and the council's role in reviewing those plans. In 1993, there were about 6 different bills introduced, ranging from turning the council into an elected body to establishing the council as a legislative body. But what really established the impetus for the change was the failure of metro mobility. Who was here in '93? Did anybody recall the failure of the metro mobility? So the Regional Transit Board at that time had established a new provider for metro mobility, and the new system did not work. It caused metro mobility's riders to be stranded on the streets. The governor at that time had to call the National Guard to operate the metro mobility. In fact, I remember I was a student at the University of Minnesota, and I remember I was working for a woman who relied on metro mobility, and the next morning she said, they never came. They did not come to pick me up. Due to this failure in metro mobility, the legislature established a state advisory council on metropolitan governance to meet in the interim to figure out what to do. The advisory council was co-chaired by legislators Myron Orfield and Carol Flynn. And it also included public members of the community appointed by the governor. The advisory council worked hard during the interim period to review proposals from local government associations, state agencies, and citizens on what kind of governance structure would work better. The final proposal that came out of the advisory council was to abolish the Regional Transit Board, the Waste Control Commission, and the Metro Transit Commission, the old MTC, and move all the operating functions into the Met Council, creating for the first time not only a planning agency, but an operating agency. It also included a proposal to make the council an elected body. But after a long debate, the proposal for an elected body failed by 1 vote. So remember, the original Citizens League vision had called for an elected Met Council. And here, again, in '93, it failed by 1 vote. Days later, a new proposal surfaced, providing for a governor-appointed body, but instead of staggered terms, which is what we had, terms were now served at the pleasure of the governor. And this is the process that remains today. And I just want to just talk a little bit about that because I've had the benefit in this role of being able to still call up Ted Coldery, who was the third Citizens League Executive Director. But I've also had the opportunity to talk with Kurt Johnson, who was another Executive Director of the Citizens League and has been chair of the Met Council before. And I remember him telling me, sitting me down when I first started at the Citizens League about this change from staggered terms to serving at the pleasure of the governor. He said, Pahua, I think that was one of the biggest mistakes that we made. He said, I know my convictions and I know that I'm willing to go against the governor if he disagrees with me, but can everybody else? He said he just thought that was one of the, a decision that wasn't thought through. And so I just want you to just, again, remember that point because I'm going to raise it in a little bit. In your handouts, there is the 1994 reorganization. In fact, I'm going to look for my copy. And again, this was given to me by Ms. Deb Dyson, House Research staff. And this just gives you an overview of that major change that happened in '94. And if you take a look at the last page, you will see how it was consolidated. And this is, again, the Met Council we have today. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about why the Citizens League decided in 2015 to study the Met Council. So in early spring of 2015, there was, first of all, the Metropolitan Council always has some controversy. It's always in the news. So this is not new. In fact, Deb Dyson told me that she, working in House Research staff, there was one session she said, I wrote a bill to abolish it, I wrote a bill to study it, and I wrote a bill to make changes to it. She said in the same session. And she said she's done that. In fact, she just goes and repurposed the things she did last year. So it's always been in the news, and it's always had some controversy. So in 2015, when I got a call from members saying, when are you, Citizens League, going to weigh in on the Metropolitan Council debate? Having been the entity that created the Met Council, aren't you concerned with some of the changes being proposed? And remember, in spring of 2015, this was the first time, I believe, 4 counties got together and hired a federal lobbyist. Does anybody remember that story? Gail's shaking, she's nodding her head. And that rang as different to our members. And they were really concerned as to what were going to be some of those changes that were going to be made if this was the tenor of the conversation. And so this is when I met with Ted, and this is when I met with Kurt, and I said, should we weigh in? Should the Citizens League weigh in now? And after discussing with our board and longtime members like Ted and Kurt, we decided, we looked at the league's report history and realized that the Citizens League hadn't done a report since 1993. So this is before that major change happened in '94. This is before the consolidation of the Met Council. This is before serving at the pleasure of the governor. And so, as a new staff at that time, I really wanted to understand the history. I really wanted to understand what were the issues being debated. And I felt that it was time for the Citizens League to embark on a full study committee. And so I was the staff member who led that effort. And in this packet that looks like this, I've actually printed for you all the pieces that you need from our final report. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about this report and how I've structured it. As someone who believes it's my job to make sure that if someone off the street who didn't know anything about the Citizens League, they should be able to pick up this report and read about the history. And even though we were working on a set of recommendations and starting from today, I wanted everybody to understand and read about the history. And so it's all in here. It actually reads like a novel. Deborah Dyson told me, she said, I really read that like a book. And so there's a lot of history in there. I went through it pretty fast, but I didn't want to give the reader, I didn't want to give them an extra task of having to find the history somewhere else and then come back to this report to find out what we were working on today. And so if you look at this report, there's an executive summary, but you can really go back into the history of what was happening here in this region and why the Met Council was formed and how it has evolved. And so I wanted to make sure that you all didn't have to print all 50 pages. If you go online, it will tell you that it's over 100 pages. That's because it includes all the minutes from our meetings. I didn't want to print those here today, but know that those minutes from our meetings are up there. So I had the fun task of recruiting members to serve on the study committee. So if you look on in the report, you will see that we worked really hard to make sure that we had individuals who had lots of experience working with or for the Met Council, but we also wanted to make sure that we had citizens, people who may not know, may have heard about the Met Council, but may not know a lot about the Met Council, and we do that by design. So I don't know how many people have served on a Citizens League study committee. Peggy, of course. But I always find that it is very helpful when you have citizens who do not know a lot about the subject matter, because that actually gives me an excuse to tell those who really do know a lot to say, stick with me, we're going to bring everybody along, and we're going to start from the beginning, and we're all going to learn together, we're going to go through the history, we're all going to agree on findings and conclusions, and only then will we start working on some recommendations, because it's really easy to want to jump to solutions right away without fully understanding the problem. And so we worked really hard to convene the task force members. So I mentioned Carol Flynn earlier, who worked with Myron Orfield on the '94 reorganization bill, and she served on this committee. I had Peter Bell serve on this committee, and I had members just from the Citizens League serve on this committee. And the purpose of that committee was to look at metropolitan governance. We had heard through talking to individuals in the community, reading the press, reading what was in the news, that there were several things that didn't sit well with people. There seemed to be a trust issue with the Met Council, a credibility issue with the Met Council, and issues of political legitimacy. So for example, if the Met Council is being appointed, if the Met Council members are appointed by the governor, and those members serve at the pleasure of the governor, who are they really serving? Are they really serving the people in the districts they serve, or are they serving for the governor? Credibility. There was, I think it's gotten better now, but there were, in my interviews of members and community members, there were folks who would say, I haven't seen my Met Council member, and that they didn't know about the issues that were in their district. How does members get appointed? How are they qualified? So this really led to the credibility of the Met Council. And so before I go any further, I want to bring up this document for you. It says Chapter 473 at the top. And as a history major, I really like this document because if I do nothing else today, I want you to memorize Statute 473. This is where everything lives. So sometimes you may hear that, oh, the Met Council's authority, it's overreaching. Now, we can interpret words differently, but everything about the Met Council is in this chapter of state statute. So one of the things I want to walk you through is just a couple. We won't go through everything, but I made photocopies of, I thought, the pertinent areas. And then we can have a conversation about some of the issues being debated today. So in section 473.145, under the title Development Guide, this is really where you find the charge of the Met Council. So I'm just going to read it and I'll give you time to find it. The Met Council shall prepare and adopt, after appropriate study and such public hearings as may be necessary, a comprehensive development guide for the metropolitan area. It shall consist of a compilation of policy statements, goals, standards, programs, and maps prescribing guides for the orderly and economical development, public and private, of the metropolitan area. The Comprehensive Development Guide shall recognize and encompass physical, social, and economic needs of the metropolitan area and those future developments which will have an impact on the entire area, including but not limited to such matters as land use, parks and open space, land needs, and necessity for local location of airports, highways, transit facilities, public hospitals, libraries, schools, and other public buildings. And I read this because sometimes we forget about what the Met Council is charged to do. And certainly, today, this afternoon, I'm looking at Patty Nauman here from Metro City. She and I spent 2.5 hours today in front of Senator Pratt's Legislative Commission on Metropolitan Government. And the things that were being discussed and debated in a friendly way today are many of the same issues that were being debated in the 90s and earlier. And they have to do with the tension between what the Metropolitan Council is charged to do, and you see the word prescribing guides. And so it is charged to come up with system plans and direct local government to come up with their comprehensive plans and see how well they match up with those system plans. And that's going to cause some tension. And at the Citizens League, we think that tension is good. That it should be difficult to arrive at a regional plan. But I think depending on the local government and depending on what your interest may be in your city, that may not feel so good when you're being prescribed, when you're being told of a systems plan that may not match up with your comprehensive plan. I also bring up the word social here because we've heard a lot of talk, especially recently, about racial equity, and there's been some questions and concerns about, does that fit within the Met Council's charge? And the Met Council would say that social is an opening for that discussion, but that is being debated today. That is being debated today. Transit, finance, transportation has become a very major issue in the last couple of legislative sessions. I think that the tension has been around transportation of where to put certain lines. With limited funding, where would funds best be utilized, whether that's light rail, or putting more money back into our bus system? Or is it waiting for that future to happen of automated vehicles? And so this has been a big and major debate recently up at the legislature. Housing. So housing is actually, so the Met Council has several systems that fall under it, and that's parks, transportation, including aviation, and wastewater. So housing doesn't, it's not in their systems, but if you look at that charge, Met Council would say, how does this not fall in? How can we not plan for land use without planning for housing? And so this has become another issue of tension. So one of the, I'm going to walk us through the citizen's recommendations now. If you look at the packet of the report,
What page, please?
I will tell you what page. If you look at page 6 in the executive summary, and again, the Citizens Aid Met Council study started in September of 2015 and it ended in March 2016. And we did that so that we would have some set of recommendations to introduce to the legislature that session in 2016. Like I said, we walked everybody through the history, we agreed on findings and conclusions, and some of the key findings related to the most debated issues were around selection and appointments. So the first key finding was because the chair and members of the Met Council are appointed by and serve at the pleasure of the governor, council members are perceived by some as primarily accountable to the governor and not to the districts from which they were appointed or the region as a whole. This structure is viewed by some as preventing members from acting as an independent advocate for their district and region. The second, with Metropolitan Council's member terms being coterminous with the governor's term, the result is in the possibility of a complete turnover of members with each new governor. So if a member's term is connected to the governor's term, every time we get a new governor, we get a new set of Met Council members. And this complete turnover really it goes against the long-term planning that the Met Council is supposed to do. So it works against the Met Council's charge of being a long-term planning organization for the orderly and economic development of the region. And so there are some, from points 3, 4, and 5 were some side issues that we took a look at, but I'm going to focus on the governance of the Met Council recommendations for now. So if you look at the bottom of that same page, page 6, what we decided to do in our Met Council study committee was we came up with 2 recommendations. The first was to go back to what the Met Council was before the 1994 reorganization, was to go back to staggered terms. So members would still be appointed by the governor, but would serve fixed 4-year staggered terms. The chair would be appointed by the governor and still serve at the pleasure of the governor. Number 2, we decided that we had heard many times, and this goes back to the trust and credibility and the political legitimacy of the Met Council. In state statute, so you can find that now in the chapter 473, there is a section that talks about a nominations committee whose job it is to nominate members for the governor to make selections from. Now I will say that the governor by constitution may choose to select Met Council members outside of this nominated list. And so we thought, well, what good is this nomination committee and what good is their list if the governor can pick outside of that list? And in fact, we had heard through our interviews, through our work, that there were people who were either part of the nominations committee who didn't recognize the final members, who were finally appointed to be on the Met Council. And so that worried us. And so what we decided to do was, and we also heard that cities and counties did not have a voice in deciding who those members ought to be. And so what we decided, what we proposed was that currently that nomination committee in current statute has 7 members. And what we decided was we proposed that that 7-member nomination committee be expanded to 13 members. And with that expansion, 7 would represent citizens at large, but 6 would represent cities and counties. So counties could put forward 3 nominating committee members, and cities would put forward 3 nominating committees. And in that way, they would have more of a say on who could potentially be selected. An important part of our recommendation was, okay, so since the governor can select members outside of that list, how do you put pressure on the governor? And what we decided to do was recommend that for each of the 16 districts, that the top 3 final candidates should be made known publicly 14 days before the governor makes their selection. And that maybe not right away, but over time, that governor would have to answer as to why they didn't pick from that now public list of the final 3 candidates per district. And over time, perhaps that would put pressure on the governor to select from the list that these nominating committees worked really hard to generate. And so that was a really important addition that we heard from members of the legislature that they hadn't heard before. We also talked quite a bit about qualifications of Met Council members. In the current statute, it is very vague as to what a Met Council member qualifications should be. It simply says here, members of the council must be persons knowledgeable about urban and metropolitan affairs. That's all it says right now, and that they should reflect fairly the various demographic, political, and other interests in the metropolitan area and the district. We didn't think that went far enough. And what's not in here is also the time commitment that we feel this job requires. And so our recommendation calls for an expanded list of qualifications, and you will see on that page 6 what we've listed there, ranging from having actual local government experience to, actually it's on page 7, experience in local government, experience in areas such as transportation, housing, environment, regional development, and also being able to meet the time commitment required of a Met Council member to attend community meetings, and that should be specified in a position description. And this had not been done. So the current statute still has just that simple language, and it's something that we're working hard every session to put forward and find authors to support this bill. Last session, Senator Dibble carried a bill that had all of our language in it, and Representative Hornstein also had a bill in the House that had our language in it. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what's being currently debated. You will hear at the legislature this session, and probably in the news, whether the Met Council should be an elected body. Should members be directly elected to the Met Council? Keep going? Okay. Should the Met Council be directly, should members be directly, oh, thank you, I forgot that's your mic. Okay. Should members be directly elected to,
Put that on.
okay. Should members be directly elected to the Met Council, or should they should elected officials be appointed to the Met Council? So there's a distinction there. So directly elected to the Met Council, or members who are appointed to the Met Council, should they be elected officials? There's a lot of debate around this. I'll just start with the appointment of elected officials. Let me start with that one. One of the things that we looked at and we debated in the task force committee was this idea of having members who are elected officials be appointed to serve on the Met Council. And the debate surfaced around, can a elected official, let's say a city mayor, would they have the time to serve both roles? And if we are looking to staff a Met Council that is in charge of an organization charged with long-term planning for the region, could that individual representing a city, let's say, put aside their city interests for the sake of the region? It is a question and a concern. So the time commitment issue is a major one. Can a person serve both in their city role, local role, and also in the Met Council? Directly elected to the Met Council. In fact, this point was debated this afternoon in the Legislative Commission on Metropolitan Government this afternoon. If we take a look at just elections today, there's big money in elections. Who would get elected to serve on the Met Council? Would money come into play here? And I don't know how it can't, but that is one of the concerns that was brought up today. And talk about the terms a little bit. In fact, something new popped up today in my mind that I hadn't thought about, because the Citizens League does have the recommendation for staggered terms. But I'm going to throw it out to you. If a member serves staggered terms that are fixed 4-year terms, let's say they are they served the previous governor, and now they're serving the current governor. If that person, who can get rid of that person? And I had heard that conversation before, but I hadn't really thought it through until today. What happens when a member serves a staggered fixed term? What is the recourse? Before, when it was tied to the governor could remove them. But now, you couldn't remove that person unless you change state statutes. So it really got me thinking about these complex issues related to Met Council governance. What time is it now? Oh, it's 8 o'clock. Maybe I will stop here and take any questions. Peggy.
Oh, yes. Once the member with a staggered term has gone through the 4 years, he could then be replaced, right?
They would have to serve all 4 years and then be replaced.
Right. So he would have 2 years under the governor who might want to replace him. It's not like he can't be replaced.
Oh, yeah, it's not that he can't be replaced, it's just in the middle of that term, let's just say there are malfeasance. You would have to write that into the statute. How could you remove them? I think that was more of the concern this afternoon. Question here?
If you had elected officials serving, wouldn't that basically turn it into a council of government?
That is some concern, yes.
A little context, there are 404 metropolitan planning organizations in the United States. 403 of them are organized differently than we are. The vast bulk of those are comprised of councils of government, COGs,
Yeah.
already elected officials. In fact, the federal statute is written in a way that heavily encourages the creation of councils comprised of elected officials. Not that they be directly elected, but that they be comprised of elected rather than appointed officials.
Yeah.
We have a waiver.
We have a waiver.
That was courtesy Don Fraser.
That's right. That's what I read earlier.
Without hearings and without any debate on the floor.
So that is also, it comes back, in fact, it came back up today, about the Metropolitan Planning Organization, also known as an MPO. Every region has to have an MPO in order to take federal funds. And so in Minnesota, we do have this exception. So the Metropolitan Council, along with the Transportation Advisory Board, TAB, is what constitutes our MPO. And it is an unusual and unique arrangement. And it has been tested, and the federal government has weighed in and says that they do view the Met Council along with TAB as an MPO. But there are still various interest groups who would like to see elected officials on the Met Council itself, therefore not needing the Transportation Advisory Board. Oh, Patty?
I think it's important to note that the Metropolitan Council's governance here in the Twin Cities region is different than other regions or unique in the country. The functions of the Metropolitan Council are also unique in the country. There is not another regional entity in the country that has the scope of functions that this Metropolitan Council has. So I think that's one really big issue of consternation with the Council of Governments model here is the functions of the Metropolitan Council, in that the council regulates local governments, it funds programs apart from the transportation side. For some people, the Citizens League and others believe that that creates a lot of conflicts for those local officials.
One little data point, the legislative staff in the House a couple of years ago reported in the hearing, there have been 22 at least increases in scope of authority since the enactment of the Met Council Act in the late 60s. 22 increases in scope of authority. So, and that means a bigger budget. We had a revolution in 1776 that said we need, if we're going to have taxation, we need representation. And here we have a taxing entity without any real representation for the people who provide the money.
Can I make
Sure.
a comment on that?
Peggy?
The difference in the taxation, though, is that the taxation is limited by the legislature. It is not up to the Metropolitan Council to raise taxes without the authority of the legislature.
So with that, I bring you to, in your chapter 473, if you look under powers of the Met Council, 473, 129, and this is one where after studying the Met Council now for 3 years, often the entity that doesn't get the blame as often is the legislature. Because every year they tinker with it, or they try to, and they make changes to it. Because the Met Council's authority is only given to it. It's given, the powers given to the Met Council are only done through legislation and only by the legislature. And yet you don't hear about them as often in the news. It's usually the Met Council being kind of beaten up in the news. But the Met Council is only doing what is authorized by statute to do. And I think that's been one of my big lessons here. And so that's why I kind of go over chapter 473. So if there are any, for example, I heard today someone saying the Met Council can come up with a budget on its own. Well, it does come up with its budget, but it needs to present it to the legislature. And it does get approved and adopted. But often we hear those same individuals say they're out there creating these big budgets. And it is unfair, I think, to compare the Met Council to other regional planning organizations in the United States, because it is a planning and operating organization, as we now know from the 1994 reorganization. And in fact, I had a member on the Met Council task force who, this was really an issue for him. He really didn't like the idea that the Met Council could both plan and then be a competitor in operating, let's say, the bus system. And it was through our work that he later came to the conclusion that while there were some conflicts, that the rewards outweighed the conflict. Because if you are both the planning organization and the operating, there's actually some efficiency there that's gained. And so, but you will still hear that, the tension between being a planning and an operating organization. You had a question.
Yes, I did, but this gentleman answered it for me. Is it a volunteer organization, the Met Council?
No. So I believe the Met Council chair, it was announced a couple of years ago when Chair Dunnick had the role. I think he has now a full-time salary, and Met Council members get a salary of, I'm looking at Peggy, but I think it's $25,000 right now.
It's a lot more than what's
We get
going on.
20,000.
You get 20, Gail says 20.
20,000
a year, is that what we're saying?
Yes. So I think the current salary is around 25, but when Gail was serving, it was 20, you
No,
say?
I serve now.
You serve now, it is 20, okay, I'm wrong, I stand corrected.
And how much time are they expected to put in for that amount of money?
Quite a lot. I actually think and one of the criticisms is that they weren't going out to their district enough, but if you count every meeting that they need to go to, just Met Council meetings, and then the meetings in their district, that's quite a bit of time. And so that is one of our concerns about I don't want to say can elected officials do both. Certainly you will find elected officials who can do both. Can they do it well? That's a different question. And I also think just from I just think that if you have elected officials serve on the Met Council, there are going to be certain elected officials who can do that, and you create a very small pool of people who can do that. And I think it could limit the kind of members that you might want to see on the Met Council.
How does the governor find his candidates now? If it's at his will that they are appointed?
That's a good question.
Would you repeat the question?
Yes, I'll repeat the question. How does the governor find his appointees now? So if,
The Secretary of State issues openings, and then people apply. And those applications then go to the nominations committee for review.
So there is a process for screening.
there is a process for screening, and I think one of the reasons why the Citizens League has this recommendation is to strengthen that process. So, because even though there is a process, and correct me if I'm wrong, the governor can still pick outside of that process.
But I was on the Governor Dayton's nominating committee that was comprised of a number of elected officials. I was representing Hennepin County. And I think Governor Dayton, from what I recall from that first time, I think Governor Dayton went outside of our recommendations just for one seat.
Okay. But I think from the general community, what they would like is further transparency. Who was nominated? Who are the final candidates? We just would like to see, and so that was one of the reasons why the Citizens League had this added transparency of having it publicly posted 14 days before the governor makes their selection. Question in the back, Steve.
Are you familiar with this new movie that's popular called 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri?
I'm not.
I'll ask you to assume it's about a lady whose daughter's killed and she's frustrated by the slowness of the sheriff's investigation. So she decides she's going to take out a couple of billboards to voice her frustration. And I was reminded of that. I can't remember where I was in my car, maybe down on 494. And I glanced up and there was a huge billboard. And it said, "Are you tired of sitting in traffic? Blame the Metropolitan Council." In your work with the Citizens League, have you investigated this billboard phenomenon? Who's putting up these billboards? Why are they doing it? Is it just a fad, or are we going to see more billboards taking pot shots at the Metropolitan Council?
I actually don't know who's behind those billboards. Patty, you know?
I believe it's the Center for the American Experiment. That is one of those programs.
Thanks, Patty.
And so do we know what is motivating that?
Well, I don't know what's motivating the billboard. I do know what the Center for the American Experiment is looking for. They would like to have elected officials serving on the Met Council. Taxation without representation was mentioned today by Ms. Kim Crockett of the Center. They also think that the Metropolitan Council is overreaching in their scope. Again, I mentioned the charge that's in the statute, and I think it is left up to interpretation whether housing is in there. It's not a system, and so I think that creates opening for these kinds of tension. I think the Center for the American Experiment would be looking for more representatives who are elected officials and looking to curb some of the scope reach that they believe the Met Council has.
If I could just add to that, I was at that hearing today as well. I think they would support actually separating out again some of the Metropolitan Council's planning and operating functions, going back to what it was before Ms. Hoffman mentioned 1994. I think their take would be to then separate those planning and operating functions again for the council.
Even if you had elected officials, that's a fairly broad scope. I mean, I lived for a long time in Fairfax County, Virginia, and they belonged to the DC Council of Governments. And I think they sent 2 members of the Board of Supervisors to be on the Metropolitan Council. But who would you pick? I mean, the mayor?
And one of the 4 counties, so I believe it's Anoka, Carver, Dakota, and Scott, had recommendations today that they presented, and they were looking for an appointed body still, but appointed elected officials. And they wanted, I believe, 1 person, 1 vote. And just think about that for a second. So Hennepin County has, what, 1.2 million people, and Anoka has 90,000. And that just leaves, some concerns, obviously, about fairness in representation. Does that make sense? And it's not an issue that the Citizens League has studied, but it's certainly one that we are concerned about and would like to learn more. Does that make sense?
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Yank Hoffman. Maybe Hollywood can get a film out of this after all. Go for it. That's not important for you. And as usual, cookies in the rear.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.